we've still got a little time before spring, but let's go out and see what we can identify in terms of plants right now. I'm in north central Massachusetts, about to go look at some really cool areas and potentially find some spots where I'd like to come back to during the actual growing season and ID some plants to species. We're going to look at like genus level plants today because we're not going to be able to identify them to species, although I have a pretty good idea of what species they might be. So because it's still very much winter up here, it's starting to warm up. We're going to be looking at some plants out of season, and I'm going to show you at the genus level plants you can identify now, even when nothing's growing and there's still snow on the ground. So I found this little wet area, and I've seen areas like this before, so I'm kind of familiar with what plants show up in them. We're in sort of like central northern Massachusetts. And so let's look at a few of these plants here and we'll get them to a genus. And then maybe we'll come back at some point and try to ID them to an actual species. So the first thing we see here are these, like, there's a bunch of these stems, and you can kind of see where they've released all their seeds. So they almost look like little cones. And so this, I was like, what? This could have been a Rhicospora. I actually think it's a Europhorum, which is a tawny, it's a cotton grass or tawny cotton grass. And here's the evidence for that. So we do have one with seeds still on it and that tawny appearance. And these are all like bog plants. So we're really looking at like a bog habitat in here. There's some pitch pines, white pines, a bunch of like ericaceous things back here, a bunch of grasses. And also there's this other really kind of it's rare in New England in some places, but this is a xeris. And I'll put up some actual photos of the flowers so you get an idea of what they look like. But this xeris species, it's probably deformis. I don't know that I've ever actually seen any other xeris species in New England, but it kind of has these like scales on them. You can see that scale right there. So that's just like a little bract that goes around the flowering parts, and so the flowers kind of shoot out of these scales and have little flowers, and they don't flower for long. They're very small plants, but usually with tawny cotton grass and, you know, in a similar type boggish habitat like this. Another common one that I see a lot in this type of habitat, this is actually a rare plant in Vermont, very common in Massachusetts. This is Bartonia virginica, or the yellow screw stem. So the other plant that I sort of look for all the time when I'm out here and I find places like this is a plant called podgrass. And podgrass is an endangered plant in New England, I think in probably every state that it occurs in. Super distinctive looking. It's actually not a grass at all. But finding that in these areas, because I've looked at the plant composition of where they would occur, and they usually occur with things like xeris and Rhicospora and tawny cotton grass and Bartonia. So they're in those like boggish type habitats. I've just never come across it. And this area that I'm in today isn't listed for, it's not, you know, there's no notification for rare plants in these areas. I just look at the habitat, take an assessment of all the plants that are there. And in my mind, I'm like, this is probably a decent place to look for this plant. If it occurs anywhere, all of these other associated plant species are here. So the likelihood that it might be here is probably pretty good. So here's another gentian family plant. This is probably Gentiana clausa. It has really dense flower clusters. You can kind of see the old petals here, the carpel. And there's no seeds in it anymore, it's all gone, but you can also see the opposite leaves, characteristic of the gentian family plant. So those are still there. These look a little narrow to be clausa. It might be maybe because they're old, but it looks like it could be linearis. Clausa usually has big round leaves. So this is probably Gentiana linearis, would be my guess. just based on the rough look of it. This is sort of what we're dealing with right now. A bunch of ice. Snowmobilers use this right of way, and it's just a sheet of ice right now, so I'm gonna have to walk up and around. Now here's another one that we can identify right now. This is Diervilla lanicera, or the bush honeysuckle, a native honeysuckle in a different genus than the invasive ones. And the other native ones, you can see the opposite buds here, indicative of this family of plants. And you can also see some of the old leaves. So these would be opposite on the plant here. But you know, a big little patch of it right here growing. And those old seed heads on it are what's giving it away from me, because I've seen them actually flower at my own house and put out seeds. So I'm familiar with what the seed pods look like. There you go. So all terminal like that. Usually when they're flowering, they're like a yellow and orange color. And so oftentimes when you find these little boggy areas, in Massachusetts anyway, adjacent to them, usually drier sandplain areas with things like this, pitch pine. So you can look at the fascicles on a plant like this and see how many they have. Pitch pine, indicative of a sandplain habitat. These are all naturally regenerating plants here. And there's a bunch of them here. So there was probably at one time the species was probably more prevalent before it got taken over by much more long-lived species. And of course, you know, colonization, knocking down a bunch of trees in New England. And we've got this pink earth lichen. Pretty cool looking relationship between bacteria, cyanobacteria, and fungi. These ones are probably fruiting from last year, but also usually see this along like hard, crusty sandplain habitats in drier areas. It's pretty hard right now, but really cool looking. I mean, beautiful colors. They're kind of dulled by the winter, but gorgeous little things. This might be the best part about being in a bog is cranberries. Oh, they're tart, nice and sour. Here's Gaultheria procumbens, and you can see some more of the those two things are yellow Bartonia, yellow screw stem, growing in a much drier area. So this is kind of up on a little hill away from all the water. So it's a little bit drier up here, but there's an example of it growing in a much drier situation. And pitch pine cones. So some of these open just with fire. This one probably doesn't have any seeds in it. You'd have to, usually when they're red and still like unseparated, these scales are unseparated, they're still good with seeds in them. Here's some bigger pitch pines that were probably a more dominant species in this landscape previously. But you can look at the ground usually and find some old needles to confirm identification if you can't see up that far. And here's the fascicle bundle of 3 needles that are often found on pitch pine. Red pine will have 2, white pine has 5.